to do that. If I didn't already say this, I'm Mary McVie, and we've been hosting this series, and we still have one more talk left in our virtual series for the spring of 2024. So we do have a talk in June. Again, registration is required. I think that you will see a link from Cindy in the chat that takes you to the registration link page, and also on that same page you will find links to YouTube where we're posting the previous talks that were given. Also, a reminder that these talks are based on the Routledge International Handbook of Positioning Theory, which is now in press, passed the copy edits, the checks have been made on those proofs. And so it is in the final stages of production from Routledge. And so as a handbook, we encourage you to reach out to your libraries, the universities, and ask them to get a copy of this. And we're excited to have this whole series that's based on the handbook, and we'll be having more talks starting in the fall, also from other chapters of authors who have written for the handbook. And I think, Cindy, there's also a link to the handbook page. You can find it on the Routledge website with the overview of all of the different chapters that are in that handbook. It has 4 parts. I won't review all those 4 parts there, but there are different aspects to the handbooks where we try to really build on the conceptual, methodological, and then look across disciplinary areas. And this will be a really good conversation to have had amongst some of those who have been involved with this that we'll take up again when we go to the University of Eastern Finland for the Positioning Theory Conference 2024. And I don't know if Pasi Hervonen is here today. Pasi, are you here, and do you want to say anything? I didn't see him. Okay, well, I think I can certainly share that the registration is open. Again, Cindy, there should be a link there to put in the chat for the conference. If you are presenting, obviously you need to register and get those things sorted out. You can also attend this conference if you are not presenting, if you just want to come and listen to the talks and be part of that. The keynotes are now up, and the conference session dates. One reminder to anybody who is considering going to the conference, which is being held in Kuopio in Finland, is that they decided to choose this particular time period to shut down the runways of the airport. So that means that anybody coming will need to take a train from Helsinki or to drive, and it's pretty easy to take the train, it looks like. So oops, I forgot to update my slide there. I'm going to stop sharing. This takes us to today's presenters. We have 2 different sets of talks by different folks, starting with Kate Frankel and colleagues. So Kate, I'm going to turn things over to you and your team. You can introduce yourselves and get started with your talk.
Sure. Thank you, Mary. Can everyone give me a thumbs up if they can see their slides? Okay. All right.
All right. I gave you the thumbs up too early, Kate. I can't see the slides now. They're not showing.
They're not showing.
No, they're not showing. We tested all of this before, just so you know. When Kate put her slides up before, obviously, as this happens in Zoom often, we had perfect technology test, right? And then we'll see how it goes. I was expecting them to pop up again right away.
How about now?
Now it's good.
Right. I'm glad I asked.
Thank you.
Check before you jump right in. Welcome, everyone. It's such a pleasure to be here. My name is Kate Frankel. I'm at Boston University, and I'm joined by my wonderful colleague, Susan Fields. She's at Texas A&M University, and Ashley Houston King, who is a doctoral student currently at Boston University. And this work would certainly not be possible without them. We also wanted to acknowledge that this work would not be possible without the collaboration of the young people that you're going to hear about, that we worked with over several years, and who really pushed us, and all of us together really thought a lot about our positioning in our collaboration. They were working with us as both co-designers and co-teachers of a high school literacy class. And a lot of the work that we're going to share with you today, and the thinking of that we've done, comes from that collaboration. And so we want to acknowledge those young people and their teacher, because a lot of this is inspired by them.
All right, good morning, everybody. I'm so happy to be here with you all. I'm going to frame us in our conversation today. All right, so over the past several decades, positioning theory has become increasingly popular, both as a theoretical and analytical framework in the field of literacy research. So both in order to capture the affordances and also think about the potential for future directions, we conducted a literature review and then considered the different ways that we may extend this work into the future. We used the following questions to guide our thinking. So first, we thought about how has positioning theory been used in literacy research to date? And then how might positioning theory be used prospectively in literacy research to center equity and design towards social change? Thank you. So how has positioning theory been used in literacy research to date? We came up with three major themes and findings. So number one, positioning theory has been used to frame the study or analysis broadly. We also noticed that people used positioning theory to name, theorize, and use as an analysis, and then to interpret their findings. And then finally, we noticed that people were using positioning theory to disrupt positions toward transformation and equity. So I'm going to give you two examples from articles that we read, and then I'll pass it over to Susan. So the first theme I want to highlight is that positioning theory showed up as a way that authors use to frame their studies and analysis broadly. We have two authors, Dutro and Bien, who wrote a piece in 2014 titled "Listening to the Speaking Wound, a Trauma Studies Perspective on Student Positioning in Schools." So what the authors did was they used positioning theory in conjunction with trauma studies to help think about maybe how these two theories can be used together to increase equity, access, and connections for students within schools. So on a classroom level, they looked at what were the interactions between students and teachers and what types of power were at play. One quote from this article states, "All discourses are imbued with and implicated in power relations. Thus, individuals differ in their power to position themselves and others, located as they are in specific social configurations that confer power in distinct ways." And so what they did was they used positioning, oh, sorry, one last thing. Thank you, sorry. One last thing is they use positioning theory to help understand how students use, we can use positioning theory to recognize how students' positioning within schools constitutes a trauma that we must hear and then proactively address, right? Thank you, Kate. I can get the next one. And so the second theme I want to highlight is how positioning theory showed up as a way to name, theorize, and use an analysis and to interpret findings. So two other researchers, Kim and Vieska, in 2016, took a look at how positioning theory can be used to eliminate issues of equity and power within a middle school reading intervention classroom context. So they looked at three different teachers who were teaching in urban school districts and who were working with emergent bilingual students and thinking about the different ways that the teachers and students position themselves. And so one of the major takeaways they found from this was that it's so important for students and for teachers to become critically aware of their own positioning in the process, because if we do not become aware and we don't intentionally do something about it, we could also continue to perpetuate the harms and inequities that the students are facing within our schools. And with that said, I'm going to pass this over to Susan.
Thanks, Ashley. Good morning, everyone. So the third theme that emerged from our literature review was that some researchers were using positioning theory to disrupt positions in an effort to move towards transformation and equity. For one example, Brock and her colleagues explored how members of a literacy nonprofit and university leadership team interacted across the first year of a professional development initiative. And so positioning theory was useful here because the research team's university affiliation kind of imbued them with an expert status, and the teachers at the literacy nonprofit who were to learn from their expertise may have potentially felt intimidated by this. So over the course of the 9-month collaboration, these weekly meetings, the authors used positioning theory to examine the power differential, like who took the lead during weekly meetings and how they took the lead and what this meant for their collaboration. Findings in that study indicated that the researchers used positioning to value collaboration and openness, openness to critique among teachers at the literacy nonprofit, which was a positive finding. And they also identified some areas of improvement. For example, how the project could have been more oriented to future goals earlier in the professional development experience. Before we can move on to the next example, Kate, but I just also want to say that in this category of studies, we noticed that researchers were pushing and adding on to positioning theory itself. And also these studies explored collaborations and the associated power dynamics across contexts. So that was another commonality that we saw. And so here in this second example, Rust and Wessel Powell looked at participants who were involved in a multi-school collaborative literacy project. And they used positioning theory throughout their study to analyze retrospective interviews with a specific focus on interactions that inhibited inequity. Findings showed that collaboration produced equity in these personal interactions, but simultaneously, they were supporting larger systems of inequity at broader societal scales. So at the end of their study, the authors posed this question: could adults facilitating this collaboration do a better job of setting up that dual reality of unjust systems, but hopeful, productive micro interactions? So when we look at the implications of these studies taken together, we wondered, and Kate will talk about how we're not the only ones who've wondered this, but we wondered what might happen if data in studies like this were being analyzed in real time and being used to address the issues that came up. And number two, we wondered what would it look like to design a research collaboration that addresses challenges prospectively rather than retrospectively. I just want to highlight one quote from that last study that I summarized, where they say, equity is not an automatic outcome of collaboration across difference. So we're saying it must be centered early and often, and positioning theory could be useful for this. So Kate's going to talk a little bit about how we've begun to think about this possibility.
Thanks, Susan. So before we start, to answer this question, or to begin to answer this question, we just wanted to acknowledge, as Susan mentioned, that we are not the first to be thinking about the importance of equity and power and how those things might be disrupted, and how positioning theory can offer that. And so these are just a few quotes I'll let you look at yourself from that were written as part of a volume that was edited by some of the people here in 2011, thinking about positioning theory and sociocultural theory and really engaging in some of these questions that we've wondered about. And so we're in conversation with these previous discussions, and just want to acknowledge that explicitly. So to help us ground our thinking around how positioning theory might be used prospectively, we drew on Slocum Bradley's positioning diamond. And so we just wanted to spend a minute here just to show you what that looks like. This is an extension of the positioning triangle that has been used often. And the difference here is simply that identities and rights and duties are kind of considered on their own, not because they're separate things, but because I think Slocum Bradley found it helpful to be able to distinguish between those two things in analysis. And we also found that helpful for the work that we're going to talk about here. We also just want to highlight that Slocum Bradley also thought a lot about some of the questions that we're wondering about in this piece, introducing the positioning diamond, and really thinking about how we can sort of design more intentionally towards the ends, as she says, that we profess to desire. And so we just want to kind of call attention to, again, sort of building on some of these ideas that have come before us. So these are the 3 design features that we're going to talk about in the second half of our presentation today. The first is exploring identities and storylines. The second is negotiating rights, duties, and storylines. And the third is interrogating social forces and rewriting storylines. And one thing we just want to call attention to, this is our a figure that we developed to try to get at this point that that while we're going to talk about each of these design features separately for clarity, they are very interconnected. You can't be thinking about them in a linear way, right? That they're kind of like iteratively happening over time. And so we just want to call attention to that before we get started. So before talking more in depth about these design features, Susan's going to tell you a little bit about the context for this research collaboration, which I think is important for understanding how we develop these design principles.
Thanks. So the project here was a 2-year partnership, a research collaboration between a high school and a university. And so those involved were the high school students, the young people in the class, their teacher, and then the researchers. In this space, we were using literacy or using positioning theory in our project to sort of reimagine what literacy learning could look like within this public high school. So we had 11th and 12th graders who served as mentors in this space, and they helped us with the teacher co-design and co-teach a literacy class for 9th and 10th graders, so upperclassmen mentoring underclassmen. And you see in this picture a sample of the classroom library that was built over the course of the 2 years. And one really important feature of this library was that mentors were able to suggest titles or suggest genres that needed to be included based on the feedback and their experiences with their mentees. So as part of this project, we drew on positioning theory to understand the complexities of engaging these high school students as collaborators. And we thought, as we think about what happened in this space over multiple years, we saw some examples of positioning theory as a design principle, like what it might be able to look like in practice. So in the slides that follow, Kate's going to describe some of the practices that make up the collaboration and how they show what our 3 proposed design features might entail. However, we want to also highlight that there were some missed opportunities, places where we might have done things differently if we actually had been using the theory as a design principle with equity at the center. So please see this as an examples, not as an exemplar, where we're showing some pockets of transformational potential.
So the first design feature we want to share with you, exploring identities and storylines, is something that we thought a lot about in this collaboration. In our initial collaborative work in that first year with the youth literacy mentors, and then we refined this over time, we collectively, students, the teacher, researchers, university researchers, laid the groundwork for our collaboration by really intentionally sharing our histories and identities as readers and writers with each other. We also learned about reading theory and research and sort of what was being said about literacy in that world. And we explored and in many ways interrogated definitions of literacy, both within their school, how they saw literacy show up in their communities, and also in the media and sort of in the at the district and state levels in terms of, particularly in terms of testing and what it means to sort of test, to assess for literacy. And so these activities supported us to articulate our individual and collective storylines for what it means to be a reader, and what it means to engage in literacy, both in school and beyond. And so one example we're just sharing here is this reading histories prompt, where everyone in the classroom space talked about their relationship with reading, with literacy, and how that looked and felt for them, and then sort of juxtapose that with some of the narratives about reading and literacy that they were experiencing that maybe didn't totally fit their own understanding of what it means to be literate. And so, of course, while we intentionally engaged in this work together, we also now, and sort of as we think about this as a design feature, there's many missed opportunities as well. And we think that there are ways that we could have more explicitly expanded the scope of inquiry to really kind of interrogate the history of literacy learning, the history of high stakes testing, and their ties to inequity and racism, and how the standardized tests themselves position readers. And we also think we could have more explicitly critiqued sort of skills-based notions of reading and literacy, and how those might not totally align with how students were experiencing literacy in their lives outside of school, in their engagement with their families and their peers. Design feature 2, we call negotiating rights, duties, and storylines. And one thing we want to sort of describe to you is this context was really explicitly designed to disrupt typical student-teacher positioning. And yet we found that oftentimes that attempt to disrupt called attention to some of the tensions that students in particular felt across these multiple positions, being a student at the school, but also being kind of a teacher or a mentor in this literacy space. And so we found in analyses where we drew on positioning theory that these different kinds of positions were either enabled or constrained depending on what students were doing. And so one example of this is phones. Phones became this like flashpoint for the young people because at the school, there were certain rules around how you could use phones, but they were also using them in the classroom in really generative ways to write, to write and to engage and to look things up. And also feeling this tension around, like, if I'm a teacher in this space, how do I, and the ninth graders are on their phones, how do I navigate that? And so we just found these moments where sort of navigating the roles of a student at the school, a mentor in this space, sort of like, and like almost like a more of a teacher position, there were all these tensions that came up. And so in the second year of the project, we really wanted to think more about this. And so we engaged in sort of intentional conversations with the mentors, the teacher, and ourselves about what are our responsibilities. So we use the term responsibilities, positioning theory, we might use the word duties, but really to think about, like, who are we in the space and what are our various positions and what does that mean for sort of what we do here? And so this is just an example of one of the slides we created as we talked through the various responsibilities of the mentors, the teacher, and the researchers. Of course, again, missed opportunities. We think we could have done this more intentional revisiting of rights and duties more consistently and over time. And we think we may have more directly kind of interrogated these institutionalized norms and the power and privilege that comes along with some of them. Our third and final design feature is interrogating social forces and rewriting storylines. And so we just want to share briefly over time, as youth mentors participated in this work and were co-designers and co-teachers, they began to use, we had these after-school debrief spaces where we would talk about what was going well, what wasn't going as well. They began to use those debrief spaces as a chance to think beyond this immediate classroom that they had designed. They began to think about ways that they could support other teachers at their school to increase choice and creativity in their own classrooms, talking to their other teachers about what was happening in the space that they had designed and how that might have implications for other classrooms. They also were able to talk to teachers across the state about what they were doing. And there's this one lovely moment where a teacher at a state conference asked them if these students, if they would come to their school to present, and the students very gently said to the teachers, you know, we could do that, but you have students at your school and they probably have lots of ideas about what you could do differently. And just really thinking about kind of taking on this role of sort of rewriting what it means to know and to have a voice in your space. As always, missed opportunities. We think here about these in terms of future directions. We think that there's a lot of promise in, as many of our colleagues have done, and we've mentioned here, layering positioning theory with other theories, particularly critical theories, to really call attention to those questions of equity and the social, and like sort of interrogating those social forces beyond any one particular classroom or school. And I'm going to turn it over now to Ashley, who is going to finish us out here.
Yes, I'm going to bring us home, everybody. So the three of us got the opportunity to attend the Positioning Theory Conference in Buffalo, New York in 2022. So this quote actually comes from inspiration from that meeting from Dr. Van Wagenhoven. So it goes like this. Why does positioning theory matter? Well, there is a great potential for positioning theory to develop into a full-fledged social theory that captures what society is and then what place agency has both in maintaining and changing of a society. So why does it matter? On top of not only just naming and noticing inequitable systems that we're seeing within the world, our schools, our classrooms, positioning theory has the potential to also intentionally disrupt these inequitable systems. It has the potential for social action and change, right? And so if you go to the next slide, I'm just going to briefly share something that I'm thinking about. I'm ending my third year, going into my fourth year as a PhD student, and I'm hoping to do a pilot study this fall as a design-based research study with Black girls for about 8 to 12 weeks. It'll be an after-school literacy group where we'll be reading and writing and thinking about our lived experiences and then also the literacy practices that we engage in. And so I hope to use positioning theory in conjunction with other critical theories like Black feminist thought, Black crit, intersectionality to help illuminate these inequities and hopefully be proactive and thinking about how can the girls and I co-design, work together, thinking about these design features, but then also maybe helping them disrupt and create changes within their own schools. So you know, I hope that you all enjoyed listening to our presentation today, and hopefully something we said stuck with you, particularly around the design features. Feel free to reach out to any of us or all three of us. We would love to hear any of your thoughts. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope you have a beautiful rest of your day.
Thank you so much for that wonderful talk. And we really appreciate your being here today and also the wonderful chapter that you did for the handbook. Folks who are in the audience, if you're familiar with our approach, what we do is we do our first talk, then we'll go right into our second talk. And so if you have questions, feel free to put questions in the chat. You can write them down to yourself for later. And then after our second presentation is over, we will take questions and have a discussion across both of those talks. I do know from earlier comments that I believe that Ashley and Susan may at certain points have to go do teaching or work with schools, so they may not be here, but Kate will be with us for the whole time. So with that, we're going to transition. Cindy and colleagues, if you would like to put up your slides, you should have permission to share, and we'll get started with our second group of presenters and their talk.
Thanks, Mary, and thanks, Kate and colleagues. That was a fabulous presentation, and we're thrilled to be here today to talk with you about our chapter, which is chapter 9. If you could go to the next slide, Thilina. Real briefly, who are we? I'm Cindy Brock at the University of Wyoming. I'm a literacy professor there. Our colleague, Pauline Harris, is a research professor at the University of South Australia, and she wasn't able to join us. It's the middle of the night for her. So we're presenting on her behalf and our behalf. And then Thilina and Rick, would you introduce yourselves?
Yeah, hello everyone. I'm Thilina Wickramaarachchi. I'm a doctoral student in literacy from University of Wyoming, USA.
I'm Rick Fisher. I'm a senior lecturer in the Department of English at the University of Wyoming and the director of communication across the curriculum here.
Thanks, Pauline and Rick. And so our motivation for doing this work is the four of us have worked together in various different capacities and on different chapters and so forth and articles. And so the four of us, and we've all used modes of or varieties of positioning. So we all came together to do this work. Now, our presentation today, what we'll do first is we'll talk very briefly about the history of modes or varieties of positioning. Next, we actually did a review of the literature on other scholars who've used modes or varieties of positioning. So we'll spend some time talking about that review of the literature to get a sense of how people have been using this theory or this aspect of positioning theory in their work over the past 30 years. Then our colleague Pauline Harris did a reanalysis of some of her earlier data using modes of positioning. So that gave us an opportunity to kind of think together about the affordances and constraints of using modes of positioning in a reanalysis of work. And then we'll wrap up with some concluding comments. Now, in terms of the history of modes and variety of positioning, just real quickly, I know we're talking to people who already know a lot about positioning theory, so we'll just real briefly mention some key ideas here. One of the first ideas is that, as you probably already know, Harre and van Langenhove discuss psychology as the study of discursive practices, and they argue that the positioning theory can be a powerful lens through which to study discursive practices. And as the last presenters talked about the triad, positions, acts, and storylines. And in particular, we're going to focus on positions and modes of positions in our work. So, and as you probably already know, positions are clusters of rights and duties that are performed by actors. Now, in their original work, which is a 1991 article that Ram Harre and Luc van Langenhove wrote, they discussed this notion of modes or varieties of positions sort of as a catalog or a taxonomy of different ways people can take up positioning in discursive practices. Now, what was interesting to us here is we had a chance to kind of spend some time analyzing that first article on modes of positioning and thinking about and talking with Luc about how Luc and Ram originally started with this work. And what Luc van Langenhove told us is that in 1990, as you probably already know, Harre and Bronwyn Davies wrote one of the initial articles on positioning theory, and Luc van Langenhove was scheduled to go to Oxford to work with Ram Harre, and Ram handed him that 1990 article and said, well, where do you think we should go from here? And so Luc said, well, I think we should, based on his background and experience, he said, I'd like to think about ways to kind of take an analytic lens on this notion of positioning. And that's how they ended up developing that 1991 article. Okay, next slide. And what you see here in front of you probably also looks familiar to people who've been using positioning theory in their work. These are the original modes or varieties of positioning that Harre and van Langenhove developed in that 1991 article. Now, one of the things that the authors talked about in that 91 article is that they argued, look, we're not arguing that this is the exhaustive list of how people might engage in modes or varieties of positioning, but this is a starting point. And so what we're going to do here in just a minute is Thilina is going to take over and talk about how we looked at the way other people over the past 30 years have used modes and varieties of positioning in their own work. So Thilina, would you like to go ahead?
Yes. So thank you, Dr. Cynthia. And then, so as Dr. Cynthia mentioned, we did this literature search to identify how these authors have, all researchers have used positioning theory in their research. So we conducted the literature search using University of Wyoming library holdings. We restricted our search to peer-reviewed journals published in major databases such as ERIC, JSTOR, and ProQuest Central. So we used 4 keyword combinations, but the first keyword combination yielded more than 2,000 articles. So we restricted our, we actually revised our keywords combinations, and then we ended up with 185 articles. And this was the initial set we used for our analysis. And then we started as a team, we reviewed the 185 articles, and the initial review helped us identify 103 duplicates. So we discarded these duplicates, and then we ended up with 82 articles. And we closely read these 82 articles, and then what we did was we selected another set of articles, 57 articles, based on how they clearly referred to the positioning theory and modes of varieties of positioning. And in this, at this stage, we actually identified 6 more articles which made no direct reference to modes of or varieties of positioning. And finally, we ended up with the 51 articles. And as a team, we read these 51 articles very closely, and we collaboratively developed a note-taking form to gather common information about each of the article. So in terms of the analysis of the 51 studies, we focused on 2 main areas. One was what was most distinctive, interesting, or significant about these articles. And then based on the degree to which these modes of varieties of positioning were central to the article, we gave an overall score for each article. So you can see this, the results of our holistic responses and overall scores in this pie chart. So we identified 28 articles which referred to modes of positioning without using them extensively. And then we identified 23 articles which drew substantially on modes or varieties of positioning. And interestingly, we identified that modes of positioning have found their way into scholarship across the globe. But as you can see in this chart, most of the studies were conducted in the United States, United Kingdom, and Australia. But there were other studies which have been conducted in other sort of, countries. And also, interestingly, these research studies have been applied across many research settings, but mostly in educational settings. So 24 articles featured educational settings, and then we had 12 articles featuring professional settings, and civic settings were featured in 15 articles. We did notice that there has been an increased popularity of using modes and varieties of positioning in research in recent times, because when you look at the 26-year span in which these articles were published, 14 articles were published between 1997 to 2009, and then 37 were published between 2010 to 2022. And not very surprisingly, majority of the articles were qualitative. The researchers used data collection tools such as case study, interview, and ethnographic methods. And the data analysis also featured discourse analysis, narrative analysis, grounded theory, textual, multimodal, or generalized qualitative coding methods. In terms of the participants, there was a varying number of participants, but the majority of the studies, that is 27, included 20 or fewer number of participants. But interestingly, a small set of studies include a participant group size greater than 100. And also, we identified 9 studies which did not really feature human interactions, but which examine print or multimodal artifacts. And these range from social work textbooks to YouTube videos. So that was quite interesting. Right now, Dr. Rick will look at these 23 articles which use positioning theory or modes of positioning in a more extensive manner. Over to you, Dr. Rick.
Thanks, Thilina. So as part of our analysis, we categorized articles using a set of descriptors that we adapted from a 2007 typology from Mark Dressman. It's interesting to me that this overlaps nicely with the divisions that Kate and Susan and Ashley just talked about, not an exact overlap. But as you can see here, we categorized articles as engaging with modes, either as signpost, as focusing lens or dialectically. And in the simplest terms, we felt that 28 of the articles, as Thilina already mentioned, were really just sort of pointing towards a mode or modes of positioning without drawing on them in more substantial ways. So we considered that set signposting use of the modes, and that left us with 23 articles that I want to talk about with a bit more detail. Next slide. So across the set of 23 that we looked at, scholars were most likely to name self and other positioning and intentional positioning as key modes in their analysis. So the table that you see now shows our effort to track the use of modes against the set that was named in Hooray and Van Langenhove's 1991 article. In contrast, we found none of these articles drawing on the distinction between accountive and performative positioning. And the fact that the numbers here add up to more than 23 is just an indication that scholars were often engaging with more than one mode in their analysis. Next slide. So beyond the set of modes named in the 1991 article, we also found scholars introducing additional terms to describe the kinds of positioning they saw in their research. We noted that some of those scholars offered more detail and explanation about that terminology than others did. And in some cases, we felt that authors were introducing new names to describe features or types of positioning that were already captured in the existing modes. And as a related note, we suspect that at least some of these additions were driven by scholars' integration of positioning theory with other theoretical or conceptual frameworks. Next slide. So this graphic illustrates just some of the theories and concepts that scholars drew alongside of positioning theory in their research. I know that this image is hard to read, and that is intentional. The goal here is not to clearly list every one of those additional theories or conceptual frameworks that other scholars were using, but I wanted to try to suggest here the kind of permeation, interaction, overlap that we noted between those additional concepts and theories and the ways that they potentially informed scholars' engagement with and creation of modes of positioning. Next slide. And it was exciting to us to find scholars productively pushing the boundaries of the modes of positioning. Among the 23 articles, we categorized 7 of those as dialectically engaging with the modes of positioning, meaning that we saw those authors not merely accepting positioning theory as a static framework for understanding their research, but they were also contributing to refining the theory through the particulars of their own studies. A couple examples of this include McVie and her colleagues' notion of self-aligned with artifact in oppositional and collaborative ways. They were looking at a 3rd grade after-school engineering club and noticing the way that the artifact that small groups were working with became a kind of thing around which students would position themselves. And so they were arguing also that this kind of attention to artifacts helps to offset what they see as a common emphasis or maybe overemphasis on language at the expense of nonverbal and materials. Another example is O'Doherty and Davidson's exploration of democratic deliberation in the context of Canadian biological data repository. And they used the term borrowed positioning to describe cases where they saw an individual borrowing another person's subject position to make claims for themselves that otherwise they thought would not have been feasible within the existing storylines. And then in terms of the articles that we categorize as focusing lens, we thought that those scholars were generally not pushing back against theory or extending theory, but rather primarily using it as a way to help them ground and direct their interpretation. I'll just say that we found it really hard to further subdivide that set of articles. I'll offer the very general claim that we thought that many of those articles focused on the construction of power, often with a focus on individuals perceived by the researchers as holding less power within existing storylines. Just a couple of examples of topics that we saw scholars exploring through modes of positioning: adolescents overcoming stigma related to the use of counseling services, identity negotiation of immigrant children, the forced positioning of a minority neighborhood and its residents, discursive construction of the other context of Pakistani women's rights. And so as a way to transition to the next section then, I just want to emphasize that some of the articles we categorized as using modes of positioning only as signposts were still quite good research. It was just the case that often those articles were focused more on storylines or other features of positioning theory or on other theoretical concepts in their analysis in ways that we found quite nuanced. But overall, our review of the research really deepened our appreciation for the modes of positioning as a way to illuminate important facets of interaction. Next slide. And so our colleague Pauline Harris agreed to revisit a bit of her past work to answer this question. How might our own past research look different if we revisited it with more direct attention to modes of positioning? What might we see that we had not previously seen? And so that's what Thilina is now going to talk about.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Rick. So in this reanalysis example using modes of positioning, Dr. Pauline revisited her dissertation study of how 5 focal children found their place and voice as literate people at school. And then she revisited the transcripts, notes, and other data from her study, but this time she used moral positioning as a theoretical lens. In terms of the original study, Dr. Harris had looked at 5 focal children's enactments of literacy tasks in an urban school in a culturally diverse low SES town in California. And her initial theoretical framework involved Gearing's notion of agenda as well as Erickson's account of pedagogic encounters. And what she did was she analyzed these interactions during 5 different types of typical classroom encounters consisting of rug time, circle time, free choice reading, station 3, and free choice activities. So in the reanalysis, Dr. Harris describes the way that closer attention to moral positioning at the same time, especially to children's self-positioning in relation to implied rights and duties within literacy learning setting, helped her recognize the differential ways that 2 children, here Jimmy and Charlie, created their places as literate individuals in a classroom setting. So more specifically, she looks at moral positioning, self-positioning, as well as moral implications. Right, so Dr. Harris reanalyzed the original data by using processes for developing grounded theory narratives and based on positioning theory literacy education studies. And she coded for moral positioning through the distribution of rights, duties, and obligations. So in this table, you see the categories, the definitions, as well as some of the themes and examples. I will not talk about these things in detail, but you can find these in our chapter. And also Dr. Harris coded children's positioning of themselves in relation to these rights, obligations, and duties. And these positionings were be compliant, be acquiescent, be expansive, be expeditious, be strategic, be resistant, and be subversive. And like she identified telling comparisons of Jimmy's narrative with Charlie's narrative. While Jimmy was compliant, acquiescent, expeditious, and strategic, Charlie complied only when the situation resonated with who he was as a literate person, but otherwise he resisted and subverted. And also, interestingly, the reanalysis revealed many positioning modes that actually helped us transcend the compliance, subversion, resistance trichotomy, which was originally identified in the study. And also, the reanalysis helped us understand how we can actually use these tools to reveal the moral implications of educators' literacy pedagogic choices for children's learning and well-being as literate people at school. And also, the reanalysis highlighted the affordances of positioning theory for revealing the positionings that can occur in these local moral orders, and also how we can use these modes of positioning or the positioning theory to understand children's equitable access to opportunities to learn and to foreground the resources they are accumulating in their homes, schools, and communities. Right, now Dr. Rick will take us to the conclusion as well as future directions. Thank you.
Also, just a quick reminder, you had asked for a 5-minute warning, so that's your 5 minutes.
Thanks, Mary. So in conclusion, we found modes and varieties of positioning being used in global explorations of civic, educational, and professional settings. We found that modes and varieties seem to be increasingly popular as a way to guide researchers' attention. And we saw that there was not a single most common application of those modes. Rather, we saw them, scholars drawing selectively among modes and adding their own modes. So alongside the articles we reviewed, we hope that Pauline's reanalysis demonstrates the ways that this close attention to modes can reveal individuals' interactive opportunities to take up and resist existing moral orders. We end our chapter and will now end our presentation with this list of questions that we feel points the way to modes of positioning can be most productively put to use. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that wonderful presentation and also the wonderful chapter that you've provided for the handbook. Thank you to both of our groups today for doing such a wonderful job with keeping time. So that leaves us time for discussion here. For anyone who would like to make a comment or ask a question, you can put questions or comments into the chat. We'll try to monitor that. You can also use the raise hand function to raise your hand and we'll call on you. If you're comfortable unmuting and just speaking into the space, if there's a silence, you can do that as well. Please do whatever is most workable for you. We do want to have some discussion across both of our groups of presenters. So please feel free to chime in here if you have a question or a comment for either of these talks.
I have a quick question, Kate, for I love the work that you and Susan and Ashley presented. So thank you so much for that, and your chapter. But I do have a quick question. I love your focus on not looking at data in the past retrospectively and just doing an analysis, but trying to prospectively use positioning theory in our work, in the work that we're doing in the moment. And could you talk a little bit more about how you did that with the students and the teacher with whom you worked?
Sure. Thanks, Cindy. So I'll start by saying that we don't think that we as like it's not an exemplar in the sense that like we were thinking about positioning theory, but we don't think that we really fully did what we're proposing. And so a lot of this was thinking about how might we have thought about how were we thinking about these things, but then also how might we have done it sort of better. And so one thing I'll say, and we spoke about this a little bit with design feature too, in the first year of the study, we weren't so much, I mean, we were always thinking about how, our own positionality and our interactions, but we weren't necessarily drawing explicitly on positioning theory in that first year. But as we started analyzing data from that first year, sort of in real time, so during the first year, we were already starting to analyze data using positioning theory and really thinking about the positions that were afforded to students and to us in the space. That one of the realizations we had was like, we need to be talking about this explicitly. As part of we had this debrief space where we could talk about, how things were going and we could make changes with the students. And we realized that that was a space where we could also kind of be talking about in very explicit terms, sort of our own rights and duties to each other, to the other students, to the, to other community members. And so that kind of gave rise to that design feature too, of really trying to interrogate and negotiate those rights and duties. And then the third design feature where they were sort of rewriting storylines, the students just started doing it, right? Like they were like as they engaged in these spaces where we were all sort of learning together and changing things together, and where they were really positioned as sort of like teachers and educators in their own right. They were like, wait, we have a lot of good ideas about how teaching and learning happens. How can we share this more broadly? And so that came from them. And I think, but I think there's also ways that could be more intentional right from the beginning, as opposed to kind of just letting it happen, also really designing for that kind of work, even in those early stages. I think as they engaged and as they became more kind of confident, that came from that. But I think that there's ways that might happen earlier too. I hope that helps.
While folks are thinking of their next question or comment, one of our attendees has asked if people who presented today would mind sharing their PowerPoint slides. Maybe if you're comfortable sharing those, you could put them in the chat. If you don't wish to share them, that's okay too. But that was one request that was in the chat. So if there are other questions or comments, again, please feel free to put those in the chat. And any questions or comments from other folks, feel free to unmute and ask or raise your hand.
So go ahead. I'll wait.
It looks like Susan has a question.
Hi, thank you. Yeah, I find this whole like layers of lenses and analyses issue so interesting and implicated, of course, in both of these presentations and most, I think, of the work. Because if we're thinking about positioning theory, I mean, the way I have been thinking about it is that it already embeds a psychosocial lens coming out of the second cognitive revolution and the notion that we are constructed through talk. And a socio-political lens seems embedded in it. And so then when we talk about layering in critical theory, which is, you know, so then there are more developed layers of lenses that can kind of be embedded within what I think of as those two principal constructs. When we're positioning, we're working at a psychosocial level in relationship and within a socio-political context. So I'm just putting that out there and be interested in what any of the presenters or anyone thinks about that. I just feel like it's important to rein in all of these. I feel like, you know, positioning theory can pull up a lot of really powerful analytic tools, and it just feels like they need to get organized somehow.
Do our presenters have a response or follow-up thoughts for that?
I can just say, in trying to say something smart about the 16 articles that we classified as focusing lens, it feels so obvious to say that they take up issues of power and often sort of with a focus on those that are perceived within the storylines as having less power. And I thought maybe that is too obvious, like maybe it doesn't need even to be said. But it's exciting also to see, I think, in Kate and Ashley and Susan's presentation, that those issues of equity and power are that I think that they were doing a much more elegant job of explaining some of the ways that they saw that in action. And so I don't know if that's a relevant contribution or not, but it does make me think about that a little bit, the relationship of larger structures of power or larger sort of circulations of power and the individual.
It seems like what the original authors are going for, to me, is to have that as part of what's being brought to bear when we bring positioning theory to bear.
I think it's worth commenting on, like, thinking about those issues of power, and also in relation to the psychosocial dynamics of applying positioning theory, is that while those are power was implicit. Like even if we go back and look at, for example, the 1990 article from Davies and Hooray, it's there. It's much more foregrounded, I think, in Bronwyn Davies' work than it is in some ways because of the drawing on post-structuralist feminist theory and other types of critical theories than in some of Rahm's work where it's more where it's sometimes more implicit. But I think that part of what my read on this is that it, because there are so many nuances and because these are so complex, these dynamic episodes that we're looking at, it does merit talking about, but also maybe further teasing out that when we say power, what kinds of power and for whom and how does this work, or how do we transform this, right? So Kenneth Gergen talks about, and this is something we draw on the final chapter of the handbook, about future forming research. How do you carry out research that doesn't just describe things or categorize things as they are, but is really future forming? Like if you want to have a different kind of world that you live in, or different kind of classroom that you work in, or whatever it is, how do you carry out research that's future forming? And I think exploring aspects of power and being developing more methods for looking at those and articulating these and pulling them apart a bit, I think is something that more work can be done on. And the varieties certainly are varieties of positioning are one way to do that, but there are also a lot of other analyses too. And I think that in the work that Kate and colleagues are doing, being able to think about that, not just in past times, but proposing, changes that are more in those moments, right? So maybe that's a bit different than even what Gergen has talked about in his work. So I'll stop there. I see that Kate has posted a comment in the chat about she's going to check with her authors, co-authors, make sure they're okay to share the slides. And further thoughts on discussions of the psychosocial power, varieties, the work from either from Kate or from Cindy, Rick, and Thilina, or other folks. Comments or questions?
I guess one thing I just would say is I think that like the position theory affords a lot of tools to do all the things that we've been talking about, and really like engage in like sort of moral orders. I also think that sometimes those aren't fully explored, and I'm saying that for myself as well. And I've actually found, even in the process of like getting sort of peer feedback or like even peer review, being pushed to think more critically, and sort of that has helped me to illuminate sort of some of the ways that I might not be fully engaging some of those questions. And I have found too that some of this work comes out of feeling frustrated when we're doing those retrospective analyses, like how did we not see this in the moment? How can we sort of do better in the future? And so I don't know if that's helpful, but those are some of the things that the ways into this for some of the work we've done.
I do think that at least one of the things that I've realized is that using positioning analyses, particularly in teaching settings, where I've done some of that work, is that when something happens, and particularly in the stories that when I'm working with teachers who are these in the US context of white teachers who might be talking about racial, issues of race, or for example, or dialect use or things like that. In doing those analyses, I am better now in the moment at recognizing some of those micro interactions that are those micro positions that lead to, potential. As a teacher with my teacher hat on, I can now open up some of those spaces a little better, where sometimes before I would miss them or I would not know. I would be thinking, okay, what do I do with this? And now because of that study, I've been able to recognize them a little bit more in the moment. Other questions or comments? I'm trying to give a good amount of wait time, which is always tricky on Zoom, right? Time feels different. If we don't have further comments or questions, we have a few more minutes, but we can certainly wrap things up here. I know that for a lot of folks who are on an academic year that ends or is about to end in May or June, it's a busy time of year. So just a few reminders, we still have one more talk left in June. That information can be found on the virtual talks page, and we'll hope to see you at that. Thank you so much for our presenters today. We really appreciate these excellent talks and also the chapters that will be in the forthcoming handbook. Thank you so much. Bye, everyone.